No nii, tere õhtust või pärastlõunat, hilist pärastlõunat. Tõlkebüroo tervitab kõiki, kes on jõudnud suurele futuroloogilisele kongressile kohale, kes on siia täna jõudnud, neid, kes, nagu Jaak algatuseks lubas, on kogunud endale oma templikaarti juba rohkem kui ühe templi, sellepärast et neile võib 10 templi kokkukogumisel paljastuda tulevik tema täies ilus või mingis teises vormis. Aga igal juhul, nüüd meil on hea meel tervitada Cory Doctorow'd ja öelda, et võib-olla pärast seda vestlust avaldub kõigile tulevik mingites uutes värvides. Aga palun.
All right. Is that Amaya? Oh, you're doing this. All right. Very good.
Hi, I'm not Cory Doctorow. I'm Mark Bouldiga. I'm going to be talking with Cory a little bit later. I'm sure you all know who he is, but I'll just give a brief intro and explain how things are going to run tonight. So Cory is the author of, I think, 15 novels from 2003's Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom to this year's The Bezel, the second to feature the forensic accountant Martin Hench, this time taken on the privatized prison industry. Other highlights along the way for me include the Little Brother series, which focused on protest and surveillance. It began in 2008, and also his utopian novel Walk Away from 2017. He was a co-editor at Boing for, I think, 19 years. And during which time he was also working on and off with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And now he's solo blogging Pluralistic. The last 3 years have also seen 3 non-fiction books, 2021's How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism, 2022's Choke Point Capitalism with Rebecca Giblin, and 2023's The Great Internet Con, How to Seize the Means of Computation. And I think those 3 books really expand upon what you're going to talk through tonight. So it's my great pleasure, first of all, to be here in your lovely city and country, and my great pleasure to introduce Cory Doctorow.
Thank you. Hi, thanks. Wow, what an astoundingly crowded house. I am grateful to all of you for coming and grateful to the Tartu Fire Marshal for being so incredibly absent. I would like to start by saying that I am by nature one of the world's fast talkers, and I am keenly aware that I'm speaking for a group of people whose first language is likely not English. I have also, by way of dealing with my jet lag, having just come in from the west coast of Canada, I have drunk enough coffee to kill a rhino. So when I start talking really fast, feel free to slow me down. So last year, I coined this word, enshittification, to describe the way that platforms decay. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. To describe the way that platforms decay. And my obscene little word did some very big numbers. It clearly hit some zeitgeist. The American Dialect Society made it their word of the year, and then I made my peace with the fact that I was going to have a poop emoji on my headstone. So tonight I thought I'd talk to you about what enshittification is and my ideas about why people find it such a compelling notion, not just because it's a funny word. Enshittification is my theory explaining how the internet was colonized by platforms, these two-sided markets with business customers on one side and end users on the other, why all those platforms are now degrading so quickly and so thoroughly, why that matters, and what we can do about it. So we are living through, I would say, the enshitticene, a great enshittening in which services that really matter to us, that we rely on every day, are all turning into giant piles of shit. And this is, at its best, frustrating. At its worst, it's demoralizing or even terrifying, depending on how our lives are enmeshed with these giant platforms. I think that the enshittification framework goes a long way to explaining what's actually going on under the bonnet. And it moves us out of this mysterious realm in which the great forces of history are causing these companies to all go bad, and into a material world where specific policy choices were taken by named individuals. And that's important, because we can make different policy choices. And as to those named individuals, we can find out who they are, we can discover where they live, and we can make some pretty shrewd guesses about what size pitchfork they wear. So let's break down enshittification. I like to think of it in the metaphor of a pandemic, that being the moment we're living through. In any kind of pathogen, we have three ways of talking about it. We talk about the symptoms, the things that we see from the outside. We talk about the mechanism, what's going on inside the body that causes those symptoms. And then we talk about the epidemiology. How is the contagion spreading from one firm to the next? So we'll start with the symptoms. What is going on in the natural history of enshittification? Well, when a company contracts enshittification, it undergoes a three-stage characteristic process of degradation. In the first stage, it's good to its users, and then it makes things worse for those users in order to make things more hospitable for its business customers. And then it's worse to those business customers, drawing value out from both end users and business customers until all the residual value has been taken out of the platform, and then the platform turns into a giant pile of shit. Those are the three stages. So for a case study, it's very worthwhile to talk about Facebook, Facebook kind of being the canonical example of an enshittified platform. And I'll remind you, Facebook started as a means for Mark Zuckerberg and his creepy friends at Harvard to non-consensually rate the fuckability of their fellow undergraduates. And it actually got worse after that. But by 2006, Facebook had taken on venture capital, had grown up some, and it wanted to open up to the general public. Prior to 2006, to get a Facebook account, you needed to be an American college student. You needed a .edu email address. But in 2006, they went to the public and they said, you can all come use Facebook too. But they had to make a special pitch. And that pitch went, look, I know that if you're interested in social media, you already have an account somewhere else. You have an account on MySpace, and that's where all your friends are. But has it occurred to you that MySpace is owned by an evil, senescent, crapulent Australian billionaire named Rupert Murdoch, and he spies on you with every hour that God sends? If you come to Facebook, we promise you we will never spy on you. We are the privacy-forward alternative to MySpace. All you need to do is come to MySpace and articulate your social graph. Tell us who in this world matters to you. We will compose a feed consisting of nothing but what those people have to say for consumption by the people who follow them, and we will show that to you. So that is stage one. Facebook had acquired a surplus, the venture capital that its investors gave it, and it allocated that surplus to those end users and gave them a feed that was consistent of just nothing but what they wanted without any surveillance. And those users flocked to Facebook, and when they flocked to Facebook, they locked themselves into Facebook. So Facebook, like most tech businesses, it enjoys something that the economists call network effects. A product or a service enjoys network effects if it gets better when more people use it. So Facebook was valuable when you joined it because there were people there that you wanted to talk to. They made it valuable. And then when you joined it, you became a reason for someone else to join. So economists often talk about network effects when they try to explain how platforms grow. But what they under-theorize, what they don't talk about nearly as much, is another important idea from economics, which is switching costs. Switching costs are everything you have to give up when you leave a product or service. And in the case of Facebook, that was everyone there who you joined to speak to, and everyone who joined to speak to you. That was the cost of leaving Facebook, now that you're all there. Now, in theory, you could have all agreed. Next Wednesday, 3 o'clock, we all set up somewhere else, reestablish our social graph, and we're going to leave Facebook. But the problem that you faced in doing that is another important idea from economics, which is the collective action problem. So you've probably experienced the collective action problem. Like, say you're in a group chat with 6 other people, and you're trying to figure out what board game to play on Saturday, and you can't. That's a collective action problem, right? When you and 200 of your friends are on Facebook, and some of you are there because you have a rare disease, and it's the only place that you can go to talk to other people who have that rare disease. And some of you are there because you left your home country, and it's the only way you can talk to the people you left behind. And some of you are there because that's where the parents for your kids' football league organize the carpool. And some of you are there because that's where your customers are. Getting all 200 of you to agree is transcendently hard. And so as a result, Facebook users engage in a kind of mutual hostage-taking. They become locked to the platform. And when Facebook senses that they're locked to the platform, it enters stage 2. It withdraws some surplus from those end users and allocates it to business customers. So there's 2 important groups of business customers at this stage. The first one is advertisers, and the second is publishers. So to the advertisers, Facebook says, hey, Do you remember when we told these fools that we weren't going to spy on them? That was a lie. We spy on them from asshole to appetite. And all we ask of you is that you give us a remarkably small sum of money, tell us who you want to show an ad to, and we will show that ad to people without their permission, right? We'll go and we'll show that to them. We will target it with exquisite accuracy. And because we're just such good-natured slobs, we have built this entire building on our campus and filled it with engineers, and their only job is policing ad fraud. So if you give us $1 to show someone an ad, that person will see that ad. So that was the advertisers. Then they went to the publishers. They said, hey, do you remember when we told these fools we were only going to show them the things that they asked to see? That was also a lie. All you need to do is take content off of your perfectly good website where you have a way to make money off of the users who visit it, take excerpts from that content, a link back to your website that will drive traffic to it, and put it on your Facebook wall, and then we will take it and non-consensually cram it into the eyeballs of people who never asked to see it. And then you can monetize those people however you want. And so the publishers and the advertisers piled in, and because the users were locked in, the publishers and the advertisers became locked in. That's where they needed to be too. And that meant that it was time for the third stage of enshittification, which is withdrawing surplus from those business customers and those end users, little by little, bit by bit, until all of the residual surplus had been removed. So for users, we know what that felt like, right? The quantum of material on your Facebook feed that you actually asked to see dwindled to a kind of homeopathic residue and left a void that could be filled with things that people would pay to show you. But for advertisers, and we tend to think of Facebook as a platform that's good for advertisers, you know, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. But for advertisers, it got worse too. The cost of advertising went way up. The fidelity of advertising targeting went way down. And the ad fraud went bananas. So if you gave them $1 to show someone an ad, it might not be seen by anyone, but you still may be charged $1. Same thing happened to the publishers, but for the publisher version. So publishers found that the amount of content that they had to put from an article onto their Facebook wall in order to have it reach their subscribers, much less be recommended to people who hadn't subscribed to them, got longer and longer and longer, and more substitutive of the content on their own web page. Sorry, let me just get that mic there. There we are. More and more substitutive of the content of their own web page. As the coup de grace, Facebook said, by the way, that link that you're putting to your own website at the bottom of your content, maybe that is a malicious link. And so in the interest of our users' safety, we're going to downrank anything that might send someone off Facebook. So now you're a full commodity supplier to Facebook, and the only way to make money from your content on Facebook is using that advertising marketplace that has been completely corrupted. And so the publishers and the advertisers find themselves locked to the platform. The users find themselves locked to the platform. Facebook has drawn out all the surplus, and now they enter the most dangerous stage. Because once you've drawn out all the surplus and left behind just the minimum that you calculate is necessary to keep all those people locked in, you are walking a razor's edge. Because the difference between, God, I hate Facebook, but I can't stop using it, and God, I hate Facebook, I'm not using it anymore, it's just one step. You get a whistleblower, you get a Cambridge Analytica, you get a live stream mass shooting, and people bolt for the exits. And here's the thing, Facebook is a publicly listed company, and investors really don't like it when publicly listed companies contract. They don't even like it when they don't grow at the same rate they used to grow at. First quarter of 2022, Facebook reported less than targeted growth, still growth among US users. And the market had a mass sell-off of Facebook stock, $250 billion of value of Facebook taken off its books in one day, the largest corporate sell-off in human history. You'll love to see it. And when that happens, the platforms, they do something that you or I would call panicking, but in Silicon Valley, they call it pivoting. And so Facebook had this pivot. Mark Zuckerberg kind of woke up and said, look, I know that for years I've been telling you that for all of eternity, your future will consist of arguing with your racist uncle using this primitive text interface I made. But actually, I've had a revelation What's really going to happen in the future is I will convert you and everyone you love into a legless, sexless, low polygon, heavily surveilled cartoon character in a virtual world called the metaverse that we stole from a 25-year-old satirical cyberpunk novel, right? And that is the end stage of enshittification, when the platform turns into a pile of shit. So that is the procession of enshittification. Those are its symptoms. If it were a disease, we'd call it the natural history. But that natural history doesn't tell you what's going on inside the firm, what allows enshittification to happen, and it doesn't tell you why it's spreading from firm to firm, what the epidemiology is. So that's what we're going to dig into next. So what is the mechanism of enshittification? How is it so possible for digital firms specifically to undergo this enshittification? Well, it's because they're digital. Computers are very flexible. You can change the rules in a computer really quickly. Like the only computer we know how to make, and apologies for this computer science jargon, the only computer we know how to make is the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, the computer that can run every program that can be expressed validly in symbolic logic. And that means that digital services and the people who run them have an infinitude of knobs and switches that they can pull and turn to adjust the business logic in real time, the prices, the costs, the search rankings, and everything else that determines how value is allocated on the platform. So for an example of this, think about how Uber prices its drivers' labor. The anthropologist Veena Dubal, she calls this algorithmic wage discrimination. If you're an Uber driver and you're selective about which rides you're willing to take, you get paid more per kilometer and per minute than a driver who is less selective about how much they're willing, which rides they're willing to take. However, if you take those high-value rides and grow less selective, your wage starts to toggle down in small, slightly randomized increments. Now, if you bulk, if you say, actually, I want my wage to come back up again, I'm not going to drive at this rate, your wage starts to creep up again. It goes up and down, toggling back and forth, like a fisherman playing a fish on a line, only this fisherman never gets tired. And it doesn't matter how strong the fish is, it's going to wear out. The pricing robot never wears out. Eventually, you find yourself having jettisoned all the other things you did in your life that allowed you to be selective about which rides you took with Uber, and you are locked to Uber, and you're locked into a permanently lower wage. Now, this is not a complicated trick. It's just a trick that you need a computer to do. Otherwise, it'd be very labor-intensive. If you've ever listened to old American country songs, by Tennessee Ernie Ford, about black-hearted coal bosses in West Virginia in the 19th century, those guys would have happily done this to their coal miners, right? The problem is that in order to pull this off in a coal mine, you would need an auditorium the size of 5 football stadiums filled with accountants with green eye shades adjusting their wages from moment to moment. And so as a technical matter, this couldn't be done back in the old days. So this is a shell game, the cup and balls. It's 3-card Monte. And there's a great video of Penn and Teller, the magicians, doing the cup and balls on YouTube, where they do it really slowly with clear, transparent cups, so you can see how the trick is done. And what you learn from the trick is that it's not a complicated trick. It's just fast. In any shell game, the quickness of the hand deceives the eye. And when digital platforms have digital backends that they can use to adjust their business logic, they have very quick hands. And so they can create a system of pumps and tubes that move value from end users to business customers to end users, both to shareholders or back again from moment to moment and second to second. This is what was happening on Facebook too. When the publishers said, well, we're going to walk away from Facebook. Facebook is no good for us. They want too much from us. Facebook's algorithm could notice that this publisher that used to post regularly isn't posting very much anymore, and they could take the last thing that was there, or some random thing from the archive, and show it to 30 million people. And the publisher gets a flood of traffic and goes, oh wait, Facebook is good for us, and they come back. The flexibility of digital, the proliferation of those knobs and levers and pulleys on the back end of the platform that the platform owners can change whenever they want, that's the underlying mechanism. That is how enshittification takes place within the body of the company. Okay, so that's the symptoms and the mechanism. What's the epidemiology? How does the contagion turn everything into a pile of shit right now? What led to the enshitticene? So some people say that it's the end of the zero interest rate policy, that when the world's central banks stopped pricing money very low, the companies started to tighten their belts. Other people say that it's because the companies used to be run by heroic founders who had vision, but then they were replaced by these kind of bean counters who didn't know what the company was for and just wanted to extract as much money as possible. And then there's the people who say that it's because Mercury is in retrograde. I don't think any of these things are true, right? Facebook was in shitifying a long time before the end of the zero interest rate policy. And Google got worse when the Google boys came back to Google during their AI panic, which they called their AI pivot. And obviously, it can't be Mercury in retrograde. I'm a Cancer, and as everyone knows, Cancers don't believe in astrology. So, sorry, I just lost my place. Oh, there we are. So when a whole bunch of independent entities all start to change their behavior all at once, that's a sign that what's going on is exogenous to those companies. Something is acting on all those companies at once to make them change their behavior. And that's what's happening to tech right now. So tech companies are businesses, and every business has a set of conflicting imperatives. On the one hand, it wants to make money. On the other hand, in order to make money, it has to share value, right? It has to pay workers enough that it tempts them into coming through the door and doing a day's work. And it has to make products that are good enough that customers want to buy them. The more value a company permits its workers and customers to take from its operations, the less money it has left over to give to its shareholders. To get an equilibrium in which companies produce good products under fair conditions that are sold at fair prices, we need to have a system in which doing something other, charging too much, abusing your workers, or lowering your quality, costs more than you make by skimping on one of these things, by cheating. Now, there are 4 forces that discipline tech companies. 2 of them are specific to tech, and 2 of them are universal to all firms. So we'll talk about the universal ones first. The first one is competition. If a company fears that you might take your business elsewhere, on average, it'll treat you better because it's worried that it'll lose your business. And if the company is too foolish to recognize that you might leave, well, then they do lose your business and they start to fail. The second force that acts on every firm is regulation. A company that thinks that a regulator will visit a punishment upon it that exceeds the expected return from abusing you or its workers or cheating in some other way, on balance will cheat less. And if it does cheat, well, the punishment will come along and it'll clobber those companies. So every company is subject to those 2 forces, competition and regulation. But there are 2 other forces that act specifically on tech companies. So the first of those tech company-specific forces is something I call self-help. Now remember, I said computers are very flexible. They're universal Turing-complete von Neumann machines. They can run every program that can be expressed in symbolic logic. And what that means is that users can always avail themselves of a program that disenshittifies whatever it is the manufacturer has enshittified. So to explain what that means, a little thought experiment. Imagine we're all in a boardroom and we're having a product planning meeting for our company's website. And somebody puts their hand up and they say, hey, you know, our key performance indicator that determines our annual bonus is revenue from ads. And I've calculated that if we make the ads 20% more invasive, we will get 2% more revenue off of the gross revenue off of the ads. We are all going to get a giant bonus, and we get to take our families to Switzerland to go skiing this Christmas, right? Well, everyone says that sounds like a good idea, but one person puts their hand up and says, now, don't get me wrong, I like how you think, but has it occurred to you that if we make the ads 20% more invasive, 40% of our users will go to the search engine and type, how do I block ads? And when they do that, the expected revenue from those 40% of users, it doesn't stay at the nominal 100% that we're getting now. It certainly doesn't rise to your projected 102% that gets us all a ski holiday. The revenue from those users falls to 0, and it stays at 0 forever because no user ever went back to the search engine and typed, how do I start seeing ads again? So digital computers have always been constrained, digital firms rather, have always been constrained by the fear that their own customers will avail themselves of a technology that undoes whatever mischief they've thought of. Now, there's a fourth constraint that also acts on tech companies in a unique way, and that's the tech workforce. So the tech workforce shouldn't have a lot of power by normal labor market understanding, because the tech workforce has very low union density. But what it does have is scarcity. Historically, there just weren't enough tech workers, and that meant that tech workers could bargain for all kinds of enormous favors, including high wages and other forms of power. So that, ironically, also made tech workers very exploitable. Because their power came from their scarcity, their uniqueness, rather than from their solidarity as part of a labor movement, because they didn't see themselves as workers, they saw themselves as founders in waiting, temporarily embarrassed entrepreneurs. And this was something that their bosses could lean into by treating them as though they were heroic figures of a tech mission. So Google could come up with its lofty mission statement, don't be evil. Facebook could tell them, make the world more open and connected, and they would take that to heart. It instilled a sense of mission in them. There's a librarian scholar named Fobazi Ettar. She describes this as vocational awe. And it's something that people in all kinds of trades that benefit the people around them are subject to and makes them exploitable as a result. Elon Musk has a much simpler name for it. He calls it being extremely hardcore. So tech workers had lots of bargaining power, which they flexed to get higher wages, but they did not flex it when their bosses demanded that they sacrifice their health, their families, their sleep, in order to meet some arbitrary deadline and ship a product. So long as the boss transformed your workplace into a kind of whimsical campus, where you got a gym, a gourmet cafeteria, free laundry service, and a doctor who would freeze your eggs so that you could work through your fertile years, you could tell yourself that you were being pampered because you were valuable, and not that you were being tricked into working like a government mule. So for bosses, this worked, but it had an enormous downside. The downside of this is if you get your workers to show up for the job by instilling a sense of mission in them, they will feel a sense of mission. And when you ask them to enshitify the products that they work so hard to make, they'll tell you to fuck off. They will feel a profound sense of moral injury. They will say, I did not miss my mother's funeral and my kid's football championship so that I could put more ads in this product for you, boss. And the thing was, if there was another job waiting for them across the street and there weren't more workers who could come in and do that work, they could stop their boss from enshittifying their products. And so workers in the uniquely constituted tech workforce were the final bulwark against enshittification. So all of this is to say that the era when we weren't living through a great enshittification was not an era in which the leaders were better or more generous. They were more constrained. Their worst impulses were checked by competition, by regulation, by the fear of self-help, and by the fear of their workforce. So what happened? Well, one by one, each of those constraints was eroded until finally it dissolved and gave way, leaving that enshittificatory impulse of the boss unchecked and ushering in our enshitticene. So that melting away, it started with the end of competition. From the Gilded Age until the Reagan years, in the United States, competition law was constituted as a means of promoting competition. It was right there in the name. And in Europe, American technocrats who came over for the Marshall Plan transposed American competition law into European law. And so European law was refashioned in the shape of the American law. But starting in that neoliberal era, Kohl, Mulroney, Reagan, Thatcher, a new theory of competition law took hold, a theory called consumer welfare. And under consumer welfare, there was this idea that if you discovered a monopoly in the wild, that you had not found evidence of someone cheating, rather you'd found evidence of someone succeeding. That if everyone in your society shopped at the same store and bought the same product there, you hadn't found someone who'd created a monopoly nefariously. You'd found someone who'd done something that made everyone so happy that that was the only thing they wanted to buy. And the last thing that a regulator should do is punish them for making the thing that all the people who paid the regulator's paycheck loved so much. And so the world's governments just stopped enforcing antitrust law, competition law. Little by little, over the years, 1 year at a time, they stopped enforcing it. They drew down the enforcement. So companies were allowed to merge with their major competitors, and they were allowed to buy smaller firms before they could grow to become threats. This kicked off an orgy of consolidation that produced the most inbred industries imaginable. Whole sectors of our economy have grown so incestuous that they've got corporate Habsburg jaws. From eyeglasses to sea freight, from glass bottles to payment processing, from vitamin C to beer, globally, almost every sector of our economy is now dominated by 5 or fewer firms. Now, some smaller companies declined to sell to the cartels that were taking over sectors. And when that happened, those companies that represented the threat to these smaller firms were able once again to violate competition law, this time by doing something called predatory pricing. So before Amazon became the everything store, it went around and it bought up every successful e-commerce company that had conquered some territory of the things that we buy. And then they got to a company called diapers.com. No points for guessing what they sold. And diapers.com didn't want to sell to Amazon. They said, we've got a very good business here, and we don't see any reason to fold ourselves into the Jeff Bezos empire. And so Amazon tapped the capital markets and lit $100 million on fire in the months that followed, selling diapers significantly below cost, until diapers.com went bankrupt, unable to compete, and Amazon bought them for pennies on the dollar, and then they shut them down. And everyone else who might invest in a company learned that if Amazon wants to buy your company, you better goddamn well sell it to them. So competition has become a distant memory. The New Zealand software developer Tom Eastman says that the internet has turned into 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And these companies, as a result, don't fear losing our business. On the American comedy show Saturday Night Live, the comedian Lily Tomlin had a recurring character who was an operator for the AT&T telephone monopoly, who would do adverts for the Bell system. And at the end of each of these adverts, she would turn to the camera and say, "We don't care. We don't have to. We're the phone company." They don't care. They don't have to. They're Google, and they have 90% of the search market. So that was the first constraint gone. Competition goes away, and when competition goes away, regulatory capture happens almost immediately afterwards. After all, when an industry consists of hundreds of small and medium-sized companies that are competing fiercely with one another, they're a rabble. They're a mob. They can't agree on what to tell the European Commission. They can't even agree on where to hold a meeting where they would discuss what to tell the European Commission. And if they did, they couldn't agree on the catering. But when those companies shrink, when the number of firms in a sector dwindles to a handful, 5 or 4, 3 or 2 or 1, it's not a rabble anymore, it's a cartel. And it's very easy for those firms to agree on a single bargaining position with their regulators. And moreover, because they're no longer engaged in wasteful competition, they have a gigantic amount of free cash flow that they can use to buy policy outcomes. So Facebook, for example, hired the former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a scumbag named Nick Clegg. They pay him $4 million a year to swan around Europe, telling his former colleagues in European governments that if Facebook is ever made any weaker, European cyberspace will fall to the Chinese Communist Party. Tech's regulatory capture allows it to flout the rules that less concentrated sectors have to abide by. They can pretend that when they violate our labor rights, our consumer rights, or our privacy rights, that it doesn't matter because they did it with an app. This is why competition matters. It's not just that competition sharpens a company so that it treats you better. It's also that when a company gets to a certain size, we can no longer discipline it with our regulators. After all, we don't want competition to improve the ad tech market, right? We don't want companies to get better at surveilling us. It would be grotesque to try to perfect human rights violations at scale. But when a sector dominates its regulator, it doesn't have to listen to privacy laws. Google and Facebook act as though they're immune to privacy law. They say, we violate your privacy with an app, so it doesn't matter. Uber gets to do this with labor law. We steal your wages, but we do it with an app, so it doesn't matter. And Amazon, well, Amazon gets to violate your consumer protection rights and say that it doesn't matter because they do it with an app. So Amazon has a business, they call it an advertising business. I use the sarcastic inverted commas here because this $38 billion per year business is not a business that sells ads. What they sell is search placement. When you search Amazon, the top results are not the results that match your query the best. They're the results that paid the most to be there. The first result on Amazon, on average, is 29% more expensive than the best match for your query. The first row of 4, on average, is 25% more expensive than the best match for your query. On average, you have to go 17 places down to get the best deal on Amazon. If you walked into a shop on the high street here and you said, give me your cheapest Duracell batteries, and they sold you a packet of batteries made by someone else that cost 30% more than the Duracell batteries, your regulator would come in and they'd find them, and if they kept doing it, they'd shut them down. Amazon says it doesn't matter. We did it with an app. Now, this is where that third constraint, self-help, would really come in handy. For example, if you don't want your privacy violated, you don't have to wait for the European Commission to figure out how to fine Google and Facebook enough money that they stop stealing your privacy. You can just install an ad blocker. And indeed, more than half of all web users have installed an ad blocker that protects their privacy. This is the largest and most successful consumer boycott in the history of the world. But the web is an open platform. It dates back to an era when tech was a rabble and not a cartel. And as a result, the platform can be modified by any party, including you. And so you can use a self-help measure to protect yourself from spying on the web. Today, though, the web is being devoured by apps, and apps are ready-made for enshittification. Because regulatory capture, it's not just ignoring regulation, it's mobilizing regulation to attack your competitors and secure your advantage. Today's tech giants got big because they were able to do self-help. When Facebook was telling those MySpace users that they should leave MySpace and the evil Australian billionaire and come to Facebook where they respected your privacy more, that wasn't the end of the pitch. No one wanted to leave MySpace where their friends were and go hang out on Facebook and read that superior privacy policy over and over again until your friends got wise and joined you. Instead, they gave all those MySpace users a bot. And you gave that bot your login and password for MySpace, and it went to MySpace several times a day and scraped all the messages waiting there for you, and it pushed them into your Facebook inbox, and you could reply to them, and it would push them back out to MySpace where your friends would see them. So you didn't have to choose between your friends and privacy. You could have both. Do that to Facebook today, and they'll say that you violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. They'd say you violated their patents, that you're a tortious interferer with contract, that you'd violated all of their rights. Because every pirate wants to be an admiral. When Facebook, Apple, and Google were doing this kind of self-help measure in order to grow and secure their spot in the markets, that was progress. But if you do that to them, that is piracy. So if you try to make an alternative client for Facebook, they'll hit you with 100 different IP lawsuits. Or if you try to make an Android program that can play Apple apps or play back the media you bought in Apple, they will bomb you until the rubble bounces. Now, Google got to start by scraping the web. If you go and scrape Google, they'll nuke you until you glow. The regulatory capture of big tech is mind-boggling. Earlier, I mentioned the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. It's this big, gnarly hairball of American copyright law, and it has this specific clause, Section 1201. It was signed into law by Bill Clinton in 1998. And Section 1201 makes it a crime for anyone to bypass a copyright lock, whether or not they violate copyright after they do so. Now, before you start feeling smug and thinking about how Americans are really foolish for having done this, the European Commission transposed this into the Copyright Directive in 2001 as Article 6. So everyone jumped off the Empire State Building in America, and the European Commission showed up, and they jumped off the building right behind them. So this blanket prohibition on removing a digital lock originally was quite narrow because we didn't have a lot of digital locks in the world. It stopped you from jailbreaking a phone or jailbreaking a DVD player to play out-of-region DVDs. But today, everything's got software in it, and the tech companies have broadened this prohibition until it can be used in ways that are just absurd, like stopping the author of a copyrighted work from giving access to that work to someone who's paid them for it can become a felony under this law. And that sounds weird, but I'll tell you how that works. So in 2008, Amazon made an anti-competitive acquisition of a rival company. That company was called Audible. Audible was at the time and remains the biggest audiobook company sales platform in the world. This merger should have never been allowed, but 2008 was the golden age for allowing companies to buy companies that they shouldn't be allowed to buy. So Amazon bought Audible, and Audible became not just the leading firm, but the dominant firm with 90% market share in audiobooks. Now, Audible has an ironclad requirement that if you sell an audiobook on Audible, which is to say if you sell it in the store where 90% of the world goes to buy their audiobooks, then you must permit them to wrap your book in their encryption, which cannot be removed by anyone except for Amazon, and which ensures that you can only play this audiobook back on an app that Amazon has given permission to. And so Amazon gets to control who can play back this audiobook, what libraries it can live in, and so on. Now, say I, as an author, write some books. I do a lot of that. I write when I'm anxious. I wrote 9 books during lockdown. So say I write a book, and say I commission someone to read my books. Will Wheaton often reads my books. Sometimes I read them. And then I have a director who works with the actor. I have an engineer who pieces it together. I make an audiobook out of it, and I sell it to you through Audible for 17 euros. And then I decide, Audible's not a good platform to me. Last year, a lot of independent audiobook creators decided Audible was not a good platform because Audible was caught stealing $100 million in its authors' wages through something called the Audiblegate scandal. So I want to leave Audible. I want to take my readers with me because it's not going to do me any good to go somewhere that treats me fairer if my readers are still locked to Audible. If I make a tool that lets you break the digital rights management, the encryption, off of the audiobook I sold you so that you can take it with you to another platform, I violate Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and that carries a sentence of a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. So that is a significantly harsher penalty than you would pay if you went to the Pirate Bay and downloaded the audiobook as a torrent. It's a significantly harsher penalty than you would pay if you found a truck stop where they were selling it on CD and you stole it. It's a significantly harsher penalty than you would likely pay if you hijacked the truck that delivered the CDs. So let's think of that product planning meeting that we were in before, right? We've decided we're not going to increase the intrusiveness of the ads on our website. So the person who's chairing the meeting says, all right, I've also been thinking about our app. And I made the same calculation. We make the app's ads 20% more invasive, and we can get another 2% on our gross advertising revenues. And he looks expectantly at the person who spoke up before and explained why they shouldn't do it. The guy says, no, I like how you're thinking here again, but I don't think you're thinking big enough. If we can get an extra 2% by making the ads 20% more obnoxious, why don't we get an extra 10% by making the ads 100% more obnoxious? Because we don't care if the user goes to the search engine and types, how do I block ads on this app? Because the answer they're going to get is you can't. Because reverse engineering the app involves removing the encryption, and removing the encryption is a felony. And so there's no reason not to make these as obnoxious as possible. And this is why every company wants you to stop using its website and start using its apps. Now, more self-help. Remember those gig workers who are being subjected to algorithmic wage discrimination, where they're being exhausted by small changes in the payout on their apps that are really hard to calculate in your head and eventually force your wage down? Well, there's no reason that those workers couldn't all get together and install a counter app that watches the offers that comes in from Uber and rejects the ones that are below a certain threshold, so that as a class, drivers in a region just refuse to take a lower wage. The only reason they can't do that is if they tried, the toolsmith who made that counter app would face felony prosecution for violating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, copyright, patent, trademark, trade secrecy, non-disclosure, and non-compete. All that stuff we call IP law. Now, IP law is a contentious term. People disagree about what it means in different circumstances. But in the context of a digital platform, IP has one meaning. IP is any law that allows the company to reach beyond its walls and exert control over the conduct of its critics, its competitors, and its customers. In just the same way that web page is a phrase that the more you look at it, the harder it is to understand, and so is app. But app has a very crisply defined meaning today. An app is just a web page wrapped in enough IP to make it a felony to add a privacy blocker to it. So they don't care. They don't have to. They're the mobile phone duopoly. So what happened to that fourth constraint? What happened to the tech workers who kept us safe for all those years? Well, for decades, the high degree of bargaining power enjoyed by tech workers and the vocational awe that they felt for the work that they did for these firms did put a ceiling on enshittification, even after the tech sector shrank to a handful of giants that could capture their regulators and didn't compete with each other. Even after they expanded IP law to make self-help go away, their workers remained the last bulwark. Well, the dream of the tech worker is over. It turns out that the power that you get from scarcity goes away when the scarcity ends. Last year, the American tech sector fired 260,000 tech workers. Google fired 12,000 Googlers just 8 months after an $80 billion stock buyback that would have paid their wages for the next 27 years. So a tech worker is no longer saying, boss, fuck off, I won't shitify this, because the boss's answer is, great, you're fired. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And by the way, that cool badge that we gave you with the RFID, it's expensive. Don't forget to leave it at the front desk. In other words, the same executives who have the same impulses try the same tactics that they've been trying since time immemorial to make things worse for their business users and their end customers, but without the constraints of competition, regulation, self-help, and their own workers. They go to that enshittify lever on the wall that they've been pulling on every day and barely budging, and they yank on it, and it goes all the way down. Okay, so I get that this is a little depressing. Maybe it's a lot depressing. But hear me out. We have identified the disease. We have traced its natural history, right? We've learned how to spot its symptoms. The company is good to its end users. It's worse to the end users. It's good to the business customers. It's worse to them. It turns into a pile of shit. We identified how that was going on. What's the underlying mechanism? Digital platforms, very flexible. You can change the business rules from moment to moment and second to second. We unraveled the epidemiology. We identified the contagion, the collapse of the constraints that historically prevented enshittification from taking root in most companies. And when a company did enshitify, it saw that that company collapsed very quickly rather than shambling on like a zombie long after we should have shot it in the head and put it in the ground. So now that we understand the disease, we can get to work on a cure. Now, there are 4 constraints that prevent enshittification, the spread of this disease: competition, regulation, self-help, and a strong workforce. To reverse enshittification, to guard against the reemergence of enshittification, we need to rebuild competition, regulation, self-help, and a strong workforce. Now, on competition, it's actually looking pretty good. In the EU, in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in Japan, even in China, we're seeing more on competition than we've seen in generations. We have our regulators stepping up to block mergers, unwind existing mergers, taking action on predatory pricing and other sleazy tactics. They already have the laws to do it, right? They just haven't enforced them since Helmut Kohl was chancellor. Now, the enshittifiers are not taking this laying down. The business press can't stop talking about how stupid and old-fashioned all this stuff is. They call people like me hipster antitrust. And they really hate the regulators who are stepping up to do their jobs. So there's this woman, Lena Khan, who through a set of amazing historic coincidences became the head of the Federal Trade Commission 3.5 years ago. The youngest head the FTC has ever had, the most powerful consumer regulator in the world, with apologies to Marguerite Vestager. She has done more in 3.5 years than all of her predecessors have done together in the last 40 years. And of course, the Wall Street Journal publishes editorial after editorial after editorial claiming that she's not getting anything done. She's wasting all of our time by failing to get anything done. Now, let me tell you, Rupert Murdoch, that same crapulent, senescent, evil Australian billionaire, he owns the Wall Street Journal. He does not pay his editorial board to write 100 editorials. 100 editorials in 3.5 years about someone who's not getting anything done. Competition has a long way to go, but all over the world, competition law is seeing a massive resurgence. Reagan and Thatcher might have put it in a coma 40 years ago, but it's woken up, it's angry, and it's out there. Now, what about regulation? How do we get tech companies to start obeying the law without doing that one weird trick of saying we did it with an app, so it doesn't matter? Well, here in the European Union, they're starting to figure it out. We just got the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act this year. They're a mixed bag. There's parts of them that I think are bonkers, but in the main, they're very strong. And what's most interesting about these laws is not just what they say, but how they're enforced. So it's been 8 years since the EU passed the GDPR, the privacy regulation. And although smaller companies were immediately put out of business by the GDPR, the giant American tech companies continue to flout that law with abandon. Facebook, Google, and so on, violating your privacy as though the law doesn't even exist. And the reason they're able to do that is because they pretend that they're Irish. And Ireland is a crime haven because it's a tax haven. And every tax haven is a crime haven. Look, if you're a company that has enough lawyers and accountants to pretend that you're Irish, then you're a company that has enough lawyers and accountants to pretend that you're Maltese or Cypriot or Luxembourgian or Dutch on a bad day, right? And so Ireland understands that if they enforce other European laws, not just tax laws, but the GDPR, against those tech companies that are flying the Irish flag in convenience, those companies will be out. And so this is why the Irish data commissioner is hearing 17 major cases a year, while the German data commissioner is hearing more than 500 a year. So the GDPR didn't get enforced for 8 years because of this problem of European federalism. The DMA and the DSA, all enforcement starts at the federal court. Now, this is going to be very weird for European federalism. It's going to trigger some really interesting fights about national sovereignty within the federation. But I tell you what, it's going to get these laws enforced. So that's pretty good news here in Europe. In America, well, they're a little behind the times. It's hard to explain just how bad American privacy law is, but it looks like we might finally get a federal privacy law in the United States. The last time the Americans passed a consumer privacy law federally was in 1988. It's a law called the Video Privacy Protection Act, and it bans video store clerks from telling the newspapers what VHS cassettes you took home. 1988, that is the last time we got a federal privacy law in the United States. It's been a minute. And the thing is, there are a lot of people who are furious about things that have some connection with that dismal state of privacy law in the United States. People who disagree with each other about whether or not their problems are problems, but who all agree that their problem connects to privacy. So maybe you're worried that because you think Facebook made your grandpa into a QAnon, right? Or maybe you think it made your teenager anorexic. Or maybe you're worried that TikTok is tricking millennials into quoting Osama bin Laden. Or maybe you're worried that the cops get the identities of all the Black Lives Matter protesters by requisitioning it from Google, which has their location data. Or maybe you're worried that they did that with the January 6th insurrectionists. Or maybe you're worried that red state attorneys general follow teenagers across state lines and into abortion clinics using their location data from their devices. Or that black people are discriminated against when they take out loans or apply for jobs because of the non-consensual dossiers compiled on them by digital platforms. Or maybe you're worried that someone is making AI deepfake porn of you. Whatever that worry is, it's a privacy worry. And when you think about the coalition that is now coalescing around a privacy law in the United States and how many different constituencies it encompasses from across the political spectrum, from across the demographic spectrum, rich people and poor people alike, there is the chance finally that we are going to see a big, muscular federal consumer privacy law in the United States. So what about self-help? What about being able to unilaterally just alter how our digital devices work without having to wait for a regulator to step in and do it? Well, in the European Union, we're not getting much on this. The Digital Markets Act does require tech companies, under some circumstances, to open up gateways so that people who make their own tech can plug into it, so you can leave Facebook and keep sending messages to Facebook. But if the DMA's prescribed solution doesn't work for you, you don't really have anywhere to go. In the United States, they're actually starting to make some progress on this. So they just passed a right to repair bill in Oregon that forbids companies from invoking their IP rights to stop other companies from reverse engineering their products, right? So they can't repeal federal IP law because it's federal and they're a state. But what they can do is they can say, if you want to sell a product in Oregon, you can't invoke those rights, or you can't sell in Oregon anymore. And there's something very on brand about this, right? For the European Union to say, our solution is, we will design how the tech companies will work. And for the Americans to say, our solution is, we're just going to let other tech companies change how the tech companies work, YOLO, right? Those two approaches are very complementary. Like, how do we know if the European mandated solution works? Well, if everyone is willing to use that instead of going to America and trying to hack their own, then we know it's pretty good. And if no one wants to use the European version and everyone's in America trying to hack your own reverse engineered solution to interoperate with those products, maybe the European product needs to have some work. Now, I think that the time is ripe for restoring to users the power to decide how their technology works. It is grossly offensive to allow companies to decide how you have to use a product after you buy it. Nobody likes this except for the companies that are ripping you off. Like HP has a whole extra campus full of engineers who do nothing but figure out ways to torture you into spending 10,000 euros per liter on ink so you can print your boarding cards and shopping lists. And there is a whole line of people to whom this sounds very good. You know, Medtronic, which is another company that pretends to be Irish. They're the largest med tech company in the world. They're trying to figure out how to force you to use their continuous glucose monitor with their insulin pump so that every diabetic can be turned into a walking inkjet printer. This is grossly offensive, and people aren't going to stand for it much longer. Stein's law says anything that can't go on forever eventually stops. So finally, let's talk about what's happening with labor. There is a massive surge in tech unions. Tech workers are realizing that they are not founders in waiting. The days where they get free massages and get to show up for work with facial piercings, blue hair, and a black t-shirt that says something their boss doesn't understand, those days are coming to an end. In Seattle, Amazon tech workers walked out with the warehouse workers because they understood that they were workers too. And the only reason that tech workers are not being monitored by the AI that monitors Amazon drivers and warehouse workers and takes money out of their paycheck when they go to pee is because they have bargaining power that's going away. And it's only a matter of time until they, like warehouse workers and drivers, have a bottle next to their desk that they pee in. It is very weird that a man who built a penis-shaped rocket hates our kidneys as much as Jeff Bezos does. So we are seeing bold muscular action on competition, regulation, and labor, and good stuff happening around self-help at the edges. And it's not a moment too soon because there is bad news, and the bad news is that enshittification is coming to every industry. If you can put a microchip in it and you can connect it to the internet, you can enshittify it. From Mercedes renting you the accelerator pedal by the month in your car, to dishwasher companies that want to lock you into using their expensive, bespoke dish soap. There is enshittification brewing across all of our sectors. Software does not eat the world, but it does enshittify it. For all these years, we've been paying attention to the wrong end of the digestive tract. The bright side of this is that if everyone is threatened by enshittification, then everyone has a stake in disenshittification. This is like the American Coalition for a Privacy Law, but bigger, because we all suffer under enshittification. So the cynics among you may be skeptical about this analysis. You may think that all of this is a lot of words to just say late-stage capitalism. Well, I don't think so. Look, I'm not going to cape for capitalism here. I am not a true believer in markets as the sole or best allocator of our resources and prescriber of our policy outcomes. If there was ever any doubt that that was the case, surely capitalism's failure to address the climate emergency has ended any doubt. But 20 years ago, the same capitalists figured out how to make an internet that was wild and woolly, a space where people with disfavored views found each other, made communities, and then mobilized offline. Whereas the capitalists of today have produced a global digital ghost mall filled with bot shit, crap gadgets from brands you've never heard of whose names are all consonants, and cryptocurrency scams. The internet is not more important than other things that we face. It's not more important than the climate emergency. It's certainly not more important than genocide. It's not more important than gender justice or racial justice or inequality. But the internet is the terrain we fight those fights on. Without a free, fair, and open internet, we lose those fights before they're even joined. Now, we can reverse the enshittification of the internet. We can build a new good internet that is a worthy successor to that old good internet, rendering the enshitternet that we're having now into an unfortunate transitional stage that goes behind us in our rearview mirror, while we build a digital nervous system fit to coordinate the mass movements that we're going to need to fight fascism, end genocide, and save ourselves from the climate emergency. There is nothing about our revolutionary struggle that is improved by our comrades being immiserated by tech companies. And anything we do to force those tech companies to treat us better makes everything else better too. After all, Martin Luther King said, "The law can't make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me." And that's important. And it may be true, the law can't force a corporate sociopath in a tech boardroom to conceive of you as a human being entitled to dignity and fair treatment, instead of as an ambulatory wallet, a kind of food source, gut bacteria for the immortal colony organism we call the limited liability company. But it can make that executive treat you as though they believed that you're entitled to a fair deal, that you're entitled to dignity, even though they don't think you deserve it. And I think that's important too. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the bit I forgot to do at the start was explain what was going to happen tonight. So Cory's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so. And
how long did I go?
We're going to have some Q&A, but
Right.
there's a lot to digest there, a lot
Right.
to take in. So I'll start with a couple of questions
Sure.
and give you out there a chance to think and see what you want to talk to Cory about. That vision of the world you describe at the end there with, you know, Mercedes renting you a pedal, us being tied into proprietary soap and insulin and things like that. It sounds a lot like one of those 50s science fiction satires by Poland Kornbluth, or, you know, particularly a Philip K. Dick novel. I think it's the start of Ubik, where he's fighting with his fridge in his door.
Yep.
To pay him.
Don't build the torment nexus.
Yeah. For you, how important in this kind of thinking is that overlap with the science fiction imaginary?
Well, I mean, there's this joke, right, that cyberpunk was a warning, not a suggestion. And it is awkward to be in the situation where so many of the tech leaders who are doing the worst things I can imagine with technology profess themselves to be fans of the literature that I write. And some of them profess themselves to be fans of my own work. It does feel a little like that sketch where, you know, Hans, do you think we're the baddies? You know, I did not intend to inspire this. Now, on the other hand, it's true that within science fiction there has long been this technocratic authoritarian strain. It recurs throughout the genre, and at the same time there has always been a liberatory strain. And I like to think of what's going on in tech as kind of reflective of that battle within the field, right? About whether technology is the thing that allows the people who've always been with us and who've always considered themselves to be born to rule over us, to multiply their power and reach into our lives and control us in a million petty ways, or whether it's going to be the thing that allows us to condemn those people for another 1,000 years to the dustbin of history and live a life of self-determination.
Yeah. So, you know, I know it's traditional to ask science fiction authors where they get their wacky ideas from, and every time I do one of these things, I try and come up with a more dignified way. So where do you get your wacky ideas? No. Obviously, you know, from the little bio I gave at the start there and the way you've been talking this evening, there is a clear relationship between the kind of tech journalism you do, the critical political advocacy you do, and your science fiction. Yeah. How did they evolve together for you, and how do they work together for you?
Well, I mean, they are co-terminal. I did start selling stories when I was a teenager, but I was also already active in many different political movements. My parents were union organizers, and my mother was involved in the movement to legalize abortion in Canada, and they were both involved in anti-nuclear proliferation. So I was already sort of doing both when I was a kid. but later in life, I sold my first novel right around the time I became the European director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I went on the road for the next several years while writing books. And so I was, in 31 countries in 3 years. I was out of my house 27 days a month. I stopped plugging in my refrigerator because it was costing me 10 pounds a month just to keep my ice cubes frozen. Those two things just happened at the same time, everything after that first novel. It's a little precious, but I think novels are an art form, which I guess makes me an artist. I think the purpose of art is to take a big, numinous, irreducible, complicated, emotional feeling that is resident in the artist's mind and imbue it in some medium, a dance, a song, a novel, a movie, with the hopes that people who see it will feel some facsimile of that emotion themselves. And it just happens to be that all the big, complicated, numinous, irreducible emotions that I feel are strongly related to how angry and frightened I am about technology. Yeah. And so, I'm not apologetic about being didactic, and nor about being expository. I think that the injunction against being expository in fiction it's a kind of cargo cult way of thinking about fiction. I think that when we read fiction and it's not working for us, we know that it's not working for us, but we don't know why. And we'll say, oh, it's lagging in this scene. You should make the scene shorter. What's really happening maybe is not that it's lagging in that scene, but rather that the character who's in that scene didn't have their stakes established with enough attention to detail 3 scenes back, and that's why the scene feels slow. So we know where we're bouncing off of, we don't know why. And so when that happens, we kind of turn to this checklist of things that we know are hard to do well in fiction. And one of them is exposition. And so we say, why don't you take all this stuff that you tried to do that's hard and replace it with something that's easier, and maybe one of these things is the thing you screwed up. I don't know what you screwed up, but it's probably one of these, because these are the hard things. And then that sometimes makes the story better. And I think that although exposition is hard to do, good exposition is just a delight in fiction, and science fiction has a real place for it. Not unique to science fiction. I mean, Moby Dick is just basically a lot of nerding out about killing whales with a story thinly threaded through it, just like everything you ever wanted to know about harpoons and ships, with just enough story to make it happen. I mean, Hugo Gernsback could have bought Moby Dick. I think even in our modern tradition, we have so many good examples of it. There's a scene, I actually counted the words in it. It's a 6,000-word scene in Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson that's about eating some breakfast cereal, Cap'n Crunch breakfast cereal, and it's this extremely detailed, almost pornographic description of the food chemistry, the subjective experience, the socio-political situation that produced it, and so on. That is such a goddamn delight to read. I mean, honestly, you could throw away the rest of the novel, which is a good novel, and you'd still have a fantastic piece. And so I am happy to be a didactic fiction writer who has a lot of exposition, and I'm happy to be the kind of activist who tells a lot of stories.
Yeah. Is that, just, sorry, geeky moment, is that what inspired the cold brew coffee stuff in
Yeah,
Homeland?
totally. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have anyone out here who'd like to ask a question? I think you were first.
Hi.
Oh.
I think it's one of the personal question. When did it all go wrong?
Uh-huh.
So there was a time, I assume for some of us, there was a time when we had digital technology and the internet as a power for good and truth and connecting people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Politically, structurally, but did you have a moment when personally it went wrong?
Yeah. So the question is, when did it all go wrong? How do we go from being so hopeful about the future and what digital technology could do for it to being so furious about the future and what digital technology is doing to it? So I think first we should understand, and this is what I'm at great pains to do in this talk, is explain that this is a process, right? That drawing down competition law sets in motion a procession of changes in our world, right? It creates corruption, right? Firms can capture their regulators when there's a small number of them. It creates inequality. I think it undermines our social fabric. I think it undermines our belief in our institutions. So, and there's something else that's going on at the same time here, which is a progressive movement that's a fusion of leftists and liberals. And the leftists challenge the institutions themselves, and the liberals challenge like the constituency of the institution. You know, the wrong people are running the institution. You know, there's 150 white rich men running the world. We need to make sure half of them are women and people of color, right? Is the kind of canonical version here, that as a result, because we allow the institutions to rot, we create a situation in which belief in those institutions or mistrust in those institutions is justified, but in which the progressive coalition finds itself insisting more and more that the institutions are fine. So the big example here would be vaccine denial during lockdown. So during lockdown, lots of people said, I don't trust vaccines because pharma companies are evil and their regulators are asleep at the switch and they'll kill you if they can, right? And look, you know, I got 6 jabs. I get excellent 5G reception, but you know, that's not wrong. You know, I have a chronic pain problem, and when I was living in London about 10 years ago, I went to a Harley Street quack, fancy private doctor, pain guy, and he said, I have great news for you. Opioids are safe. You should just take opioids for the rest of your life, and it won't be a problem. There's new research, and it's fine. And so I did my own research, right? Read articles that I'm in no way qualified to read, and I concluded that the pharma companies were evil and they would kill me for €1 and that the regulators would let them get away with it, and I became an opioid denier. And when we tell people, actually the institutions are fine and you're stupid for thinking that they're bad, as opposed to, here's a more complicated, nuanced stories about why generally we can't trust the pharma companies and why generally you should be suspicious of their regulators. But in this specific instance, we think it's okay, right? And when we just tell them you're stupid, then it just breeds mistrust. When we cede radicalism to the right and we make progressivism the movement of the status quo, I think that we set up this circumstances for things getting worse. And the connection here is that the reason pharma companies can be evil and kill you and their regulators let them get away with it is there's only a half a dozen of them. And they collude to rig the system. I worked on the Access to Medicines Treaty at WIPO. You know, I saw them do it, right? They captured their regulators over and over again. And so the way things went bad is we allow companies to form monopolies. We did that as part of a political project that ceded radicalism to the right. We allowed our institutions to rot from within. And as people who cared about technology, the thing that we missed was not the power of technology to liberate us. I firmly believe that technology is a force for liberation and for radical action. Look, I spent my teenage years riding a bicycle around Toronto with a bucket of wheat paste, you know, flour and water and a paintbrush and 1,000 flyers for a demonstration, sticking them up on telephone poles. Until you've done that, don't tell me that we can organize a radical movement without the internet, right? I firmly believe that technology can liberate us. However, what we missed was that competition law had been shot in the guts and it was bleeding out. And that what we were seeing was not competition law that was weak but at a steady state, but competition law that was getting weaker and weaker. You know, Ronald Reagan hit the campaign trail the same year the Apple II Plus went on sale. He gets into power, he lets IBM off the hook. They had been through a 12-year antitrust trial. They spent more at that trial every year on lawyers than the Department of Justice spent for all the lawyers fighting all the antitrust cases in the world, in the country, for 12 consecutive years. They called it Antitrust's Vietnam. And after 12 years, they waited it out. Reagan let them off the hook. But he did shut down AT&T, broke up AT&T. And then the Department of Justice went after Microsoft. Microsoft also ran out the clock, but they waited for George Bush to get elected, and then he dropped the case against them. But they were so traumatized by the antitrust case that they let Google live. They didn't do to Google what they did to Netscape. And so if you're sitting on the outside of this, it can seem like, okay, well, antitrust law sometimes comes in slow. Sometimes it lets them off the hook. But at least it's working. And what we didn't realize was that it was working less and less and less, that antitrust had become this insular, weird, mutated, sick thing that today is, finally reawakening. But just a few years ago, well, look, we couldn't even stop Microsoft from buying Activision. Jesus Christ, you could not ask for a more anti-competitive merger that is going to have more impact on more young people, creative workers, computer scientists, network operators. I mean, it's a travesty, right? And that's the state of antitrust law. And so we just let this happen because we were looking in the wrong place, right? We were looking at the power of technology. We were ignoring the structure of the firms that built the technology.
Back in 2016, Bill Gibson tweeted that the 22nd century, Google it, go ahead, scarcely a soul alive has a word to offer about it, and it's a mere 8 decades away. And then a subsequent interview, he said that we see the phrase 22nd century almost never compared to the 19th century, sorry, 20th century, talking about the 21st century. Yeah. And I think obviously a lot of your own fiction comes from this very immediate urgency, and it's almost entirely near future fiction. Can you imagine a situation where you felt liberated from this moment to write something said 100 years in the future rather than 20 minutes in the future?
I mean, it's much easier to write something like 1,000 years in the future. Ben Rosenbaum and I wrote a story set like 10,000 years in the future. 100 years in the future, it's just going to be a parable because it can't even have a pretense. I mean, there's the old Robert A. Timeline thing of like pretending that you can project out into the future, but I don't think that, I think there will be a future in 100 years. I think there will be humans in it, but what it looks like, I think is totally up for grabs and a lot weirder than anything we could imagine. And the only point of that exercise would be just to assert that there isn't a future that is foreordained and that the future could be almost anything. The rallying cry of the neoliberal project, Margaret Thatcher's aphorism is, there is no alternative. And you couldn't ask for a more anti-science fiction phrase, right? Like my job as a science fiction writer is to just like come up with a half dozen alternatives before breakfast. The purpose of this is to do hegemony, right? It's to extinguish the imaginative act itself. And so asserting that different things could happen is not in any way predictive, but it is liberating in the sense that it makes people think, oh, well, something different might happen in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, I think.
You kind of glossed over the fourth thing in terms of how it came to be that a lot of tech people were suddenly made redundant. Mm-hmm. On the other end, that's probably not coming back as a force, is it?
So the question is, how were so many tech workers made redundant? And are they coming back as a force? Well, there's a couple of things that went on there. So one is that just we had more tech workers enter the workforce, right? So they just became less scarce, right? All of those years of learn to code actually produced a lot of coders. But the other thing that happened is that the firms stopped caring so much about quality, right? A lot of those tech workers did things that were hard to automate, but nevertheless contributed to quality. So, think about Twitter's moderator workforce. Google, you can really see this in decline with Google, not just where like some of their search results have gotten worse, but their anti-fraud has gotten much worse. And that's just a labor-intensive project, right? Where you're just going in and you're reviewing, like someone buys an ad and a human being reviews it to make sure it's not a scam, and then and clicks through it and spends some time with it. So, last year I had a friend over for dinner. And we were watching a movie, and I was going to order Thai food from our little Thai restaurant up the street. So I Googled them on my phone, and I clicked the link, and I ordered dinner. And then 15 minutes later, the restaurant called me, and they said, "You didn't order dinner from us. That's another company that has bought our name. They bought the link on Google, the top search result. They have a lookalike website that's 15% more expensive than our food. You order it from them, they order it from us, and they keep the 15%. So we have canceled your order, come in and pick up your food, but pay for it when you get here." Now that's just, and there were 1,000 of them. We looked into it. There were 1,000 of these restaurant websites that had taken out ads on Google. And this is a verified merchant, right? Google has like sent that merchant a postcard with a number on it. They've keyed that number in. Google knows how to reach them and so on. It just requires some shoe leather. Like someone has to look at the ads when they're bought and go, oh yeah, that doesn't look right. That's an exception. We have a known merchant with a known website. Someone else has bought that and they've got a lookalike website. We're not going to take that ad. And it gets worse than that. Also last year, there was a period of a 4-day weekend when if you looked up any airline in the United States, the toll-free number that appeared went to a scam boiler room that would pretend to be the airline and take your credit card to change or sell you a plane ticket and then just steal the money. And again, this is just removing Jenga blocks from the tower because you don't care if it falls over anymore.
It's kind of related to the gentrification where
Yeah.
because everything else allows you to gentrify, you lay people off.
That's right. No one cares. If you don't have to care about quality because you have a monopoly, we don't have to care we're the phone company.
So, just put,
Will the workforce come back? I think that the leverage of the workforce? Yeah, I think the leverage of the workforce will come from, not from scarcity, it'll come from solidarity, it'll come from unions.
see, over here.
But what if I'm lazy? Like, it's easier to pay for YouTube Pro to see with it without ads, to have all my games on Steam because they are in the
Yep.
place, than doing evolution.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Look, I want your lazy life to be as good as possible. If the company knows that you could leave, they'll try and figure out how to stop you from leaving, right? So it's for the lazy that we do this, right? Because what disciplines the company, like why does the airline that you're a frequent flyer on treat you well? Well, it's because they know the other airlines, most of the airlines are gonna, when if you buy a ticket from them, they'll reward you for it by like beating you about the head and shoulders, right? But if you're actually that, rare 1 in 1,000 flyers who's slowly destroying the planet by taking, 90% of the flights, the airline will treat you really well. And if you have a 33rd order Mason gold card with one airline, you call another airline, they'll process you in at that level to switch. So that airline treats you really well. They used to treat regular flyers well too, back when they feared competition, but they don't fear the competition anymore. It used to be you could just fly whatever airline was going out of your local airport when the GPS wasn't being jammed and get to where you were going. And not anymore, right? Now it's a very bad deal all around. And so the way you get a better deal is by disciplining those companies with the fear of regulation and competition, with the fear that they will lose from treating you badly. That's how you get them to treat you well. Amazon Prime used to be a really good deal for lazy people, and they took that thing that you're paying for and they put ads in it. Windows, if you buy Windows 11, they will put ads in it. If you buy a Roku, right, the little streaming box, the lazy TV watcher's best friend, they have just announced a pilot program where if you pause your television, they'll show you an ad. Right? This is not a free gadget, this is a gadget you bought, right? And so the saying, even if you're paying for the product, or rather, if you're not paying for the product, you're the product, is really incomplete. There are lots of times where you can pay for the product and they'll still treat you like the product. Remember, Apple last year updated the iPhone so that with one click you could opt out of Facebook tracking. 96% of iOS users clicked that box. Presumably the other 4% were confused or working for Facebook, right? That is very good. That's Apple treating you well. At the same time, Apple instituted a secret surveillance program on its iOS devices, its iPhones, that spy on you, gather the same data Facebook was gathering, and use it to target ads to you on your phone, right? The fact that you gave them $1,000 doesn't make them treat you well. The thing that makes them treat you well is knowing that you can leave, right? Knowing that you can go somewhere else. So if you want to stay inside the walled garden, and have it not turn into a prison, then you have to have a key to the door. You don't ever have to use it, but so long as you have the key, they'll treat you better. Yeah.
I was born in 97, so I'm among some of the first digital users. My social circles in middle school and high school were made through Facebook. I didn't have MySpace. It was before.
Right.
I graduated in 2020 from university. My final year of university was during lockdown overseas. imagine, because everything that we sort of grew up with collapsed around us whilst we were still learning how the world works. And I was just wondering, especially attending talks like this about the institution of the internet, and you're sat here like, well, shit, we've got to live through it and make some more. And I code, I learned to code in school, and I know how to build a server and run things. Like, could you speak a little bit on the hope for
Yeah.
the future?
Yeah.
Because I need a little bit more.
So the question is, where does hope for the future come from? So I want to distinguish hope from optimism here. I think optimism is a fool's errand. I think optimism and pessimism are both a form of fatalism. Optimism and pessimism are just the belief that whether or not you act or don't, either things will get better, that's optimism, or worse, that's pessimism. Hope is the idea that if you take some affirmative step, you can ascend to the gradient towards the world you want to live in, and that you will attain a vantage point from which new paths will be revealed. That just because you can't see a way to go from A to Z, it doesn't mean that the path doesn't exist, right? And in fact, the only people who can chart a course through a complicated terrain from A to Z like that are novelists, because novelists start at the end and work their way back, right? And we have a neat, tidy, sort of plot curve that rises to a climax, has a denouement, and everyone goes off and gets a medal from Princess Leia, right? That's the way novels work. In the real world, the way that it works is in fits and starts with lots of reversals and so on. But there are lots of opportunities. There are lots of affirmative steps that we can take right now that take us up this gradient and take us to areas of the terrain that we've never surveyed before. So the competition laws that we have now, the good laws that are on the books that we're starting to enforce again, they were passed under conditions of extreme peril, inequality, and political corruption, right? There's this old saying, in order to have a law, first you have to have a crime. We didn't have competition laws on the books before we had robber barons, right? We had to make the competition laws while the robber barons had their boots on our necks, right? So we did it. The praxis by which we overthrew John D. Rockefeller, a villain who makes Bill Gates look like Pee Wee Herman, right? That praxis is not lost. It's not like embalming pharaohs, right? Like, we know how it was done, and it's an amazing story. So they passed the Sherman Act in 1890. They don't enforce it because they pass the law, but the monopolies won't let them enforce it. So 20 years goes by, and this woman, Ida Tarbell, who was the first woman in the United States to get a science degree. She was a biologist. Her father was a Pennsylvania oilman who'd been destroyed by John D. Rockefeller. She became an investigative journalist. She syndicated a 2-volume history of how John D. Rockefeller had taken over America. This was before they invented good titles, so it's called The History of the Standard Oil Company, Volumes 1 and 2. It was syndicated in this magazine, Collier's, which was a national magazine at the time. It was read by millions. John D. Rockefeller hated Ida Tarbell. He called her Ida Tarbarrel, and he thought that there was no way she was ever going to bring his empire down. In the end, this pitiless investigative prose that laid bare the crimes that everyone around was experiencing at the hands of John D. Rockefeller and the trusts created the political will to break up the largest corporate empire the world had ever seen, right? This is not a lost art, right? Like, we know how they did it. Now, we are in this moment where for the first time in generations, people are waking up and going, concentrated corporate power is incompatible with human thriving and maybe with a survivable planet. And people across different sectors are saying, wait a second, you care about one thing and I care about something else, but we actually care about the same thing here because we care about corporate concentration. The last time this happened, it was with the word ecology. Before the term ecology was coined in the 1970s, or came into widespread use in the 1970s, people didn't know they were on the same side. You care about owls, I care about the ozone layer. What does, like, the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere have to do with your charismatic nocturnal avians? But the term ecology turns 1,000 issues into a global movement, right? We now have this moment where people who care about different sectors of the world, of the economy, are all recognizing that what they really care about is competition. Maybe you care that one company, a European company, Luxottica Essilor, Luxottica is Italian, Essilor is French, They bought every eyeglass brand you've ever heard of, Dolce & Gabbana, Coach, Oakley, Bausch & Lomb. They also own every high street eyeglass retailer, LensCrafters, Sunglass Hut, and so on. Essilor makes more than half of the world's optical lenses, and they also own IMED, which is the largest insurer in the world. They've raised the price of glasses 1,000% in the last decade. So you care about the fact that these motherfuckers stole your eyes, right? Someone else cares about the fact that 2 companies control all the beer, right? Someone else cares about the fact that there are 3 cartels that control all the world's sea freight. And for years, the regulators kept telling them, hey, I know you get these economies of scale when you make the ship bigger, but isn't one of them eventually going to get stuck in the Suez Canal? And they were like, fuck off, what do you know about shipping? You don't have any ships, we got the ships, it'll be fine, right? There are so many people who are angry about corporate concentration, and they're starting to recognize that they're all angry about corporate concentration and not shipping or beer, eyeglasses, vitamin C, bottle caps, saline, surgical saline, one company, right? And that the misery that they are experiencing is misery that they have solidarity with other people over. And our regulators are actually doing something about it. We have a tailwind with our regulators in a way that I have not seen in my decades of working on this. I understand how depressing it must be to have graduated uni in 2020. I spent your entire lifetime getting my ass kicked by giant corporations in forums where we were massively outgunned, barely holding our own and often losing, right? And just fighting a rearguard action. I woke up one morning a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden there were people in office all over the world who actually gave a shit and wanted to do the right thing, had experts on their side, were making laws that made a difference, and actually enforcing them. So this is an incredible moment. It's a very fraught moment. Genocide, climate emergency, the ongoing pandemic, and the pandemic's on our horizon, right? All of those things are crazy, but we are entering this period with momentum that I would have not thought we would have. You know, this is, I wake up every morning and I cannot believe just how incredible all this stuff is right now at this moment. It's wild. The Digital Markets Act is huge. China, in the Chinese Cyberspace Act, requires its tech companies to allow interoperability because the Chinese state, not one of your better governments, woke up and realized that those tech companies were not its projections of soft power abroad, but rather competitors with it for sovereignty. And so they said, we need to weaken these corporations because a strong corporate sector comes at the expense of a effective government. And so everywhere you look, we're getting Canada, where I'm from, which is home to the evil billionaire. We have this guy, Galen Weston, who owns all the grocery stores, who's been like LARPing Les Mis. He price-fixed bread, right? You do not get more Les Mis ass than price-fixing bread. Canada has just announced that we're going to amend our competition law to add what's called the abuse of dominance standard, which is like the bare minimum for a competition law. It's literally what it sounds like. It's illegal to abuse your dominance. It wasn't illegal in Canada to abuse your, it's still not illegal. They're going to fix it this year. This is like having a criminal code with no murder statute. But we're finally doing it in Canada, right? So everywhere I look, on the momentum for addressing the systemic nature of the rot is growing. It's so easy to just think about the superficial factors and to think about the symptoms. And oftentimes you have to think about the symptoms because when everyone's got the pandemic or everything's on fire or whatever, you've got to deal with it. And oftentimes that can keep you from thinking about the underlying roots of the problem. But we actually have a global movement to think about those roots. It is a really exciting moment. I hope that gives you some hope. I don't know. I want to take a question from someone who hasn't asked one, but we can maybe talk about that later.
We do have to
we
wrap
gotta
up,
wrap?
I'm afraid.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, because my very last question, if I needed emergency questions, was about hope, and that was a brilliant, inspirational
Excellent.
ending for us. So
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Cory Doctorow for a brilliant evening.
Thank you very much.